So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a law passed in response to a lot of the brutality and resistance that minority voters, in particular African American and Hispanic voters in the South, were facing when it came to exercising their fundamental right to vote. So Congress responded with passage of the Voting Rights Act, and since then it has been widely considered as one of the most successful pieces of civil rights legislation passed during that era.
I recall 50 years ago when I was a young college student caught up in a movement, and there's a special feeling about being part of the civil rights movement. I played a very small role, very, very small role. Students from my college had gone south to help people to register to vote in summers before. Some of them lost their lives as a result of that. Being there in Selma, Alabama, on the march for the Voting Rights Act was something that really may have affected the rest of my life and the work that I've done for the rest of my life.
And so the ACLU has been one of the main leading organizations filing lawsuits under the Voting Rights Act to challenge practices ranging from at-large election schemes where residents were not able to have as much influence in the voting rights process and elect candidates of choice, to the placement of polling places, and more current day to laws that require voter ID or proof of citizenship.
And now here we are 50 years later, and we're fighting the same forces, the same issue, much more sophisticated opponents. We're not talking about people who just, beat you to death because you try to register to vote or ask you to recite the preamble to the Constitution backwards because you want to try to register to vote. Now we're dealing with much more sophisticated opponents.
So Shelby County, Alabama is a jurisdiction that actually has a very long history of discrimination when it comes to African Americans being denied the right to vote. When Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006, Shelby County actually filed a lawsuit challenging the reauthorization, arguing that it was out of date. The ACLU Voting Rights Project represented the NAACP Alabama State Conference, and I was very proud to be one of the main lead attorneys representing the NAACP as interveners in that case, in which we presented evidence to the court as to why the Voting Rights Act was still necessary today. They essentially gutted Section 5 and stated that it was outdated. So what that means today is that those jurisdictions that were covered under the Act, including 5 here in Florida, can now institute changes without that buffer that Section 5 provided originally. So now it's put a lot of pressure and onus on community groups and organizations like the ACLU to remain vigilant in tracking what kind of voting changes are coming through, as well as finding new legal avenues to challenge laws that we believe are still unnecessarily restrictive and discriminatory.
They talk about voter fraud and why it's necessary to have a strict voter ID and not allow student ID to be used, and why we can't have same-day voter registration, and why we have to have restrictions on how many early voting days there can be. And then, of course, the most effective voter suppression of all, the lifetime felon disfranchisement in the state of Florida.
Well, in Florida, about 1 in 10 Floridians cannot vote due to felony disenfranchisement, and it's about 1 in 4 African American Floridians that are denied the right to vote due to a felony conviction. I really just think that we need to wake up as a society and know what's going on. I think it's a disgrace that 50 years after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, almost 6 million people weren't able to vote in the last election due to felony disenfranchisement.
I think the most shameful aspect of voting restrictions anywhere in the country is here in the state of Florida. The lifetime felon disfranchisement that we have here, with maybe almost 2 million people who are locked out of the voting booth. It was designed in 1868 to rob as many black people as possible of their right to vote, and that's its purpose now, 150, 200 years later.
This is an ongoing fight, and obviously the roots date back to that era, and they're just ongoing, and it's sad. It's a sad reality.
For sure, if you are able to vote, you should vote. That is the reason why we have the Voting Rights Act, and the ACLU has dedicated so many resources to this issue. That is an important right, fundamental right that we have, that we are strongly encouraging people to exercise.
It was then and still remains maybe the most important issue, I think, in this country, fighting for the right to vote.